I will not be turning on my video because my Wi-Fi is quite weak where I am. Okay. Starting in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Three things in this speech. Firstly, talking about closing opposition, the theme of insurance. Second, talking about opening opposition, the theme of negative PR. And then talking about opening government, the theme of, everything is low premiums and therefore perverse incentives. Firstly, on closing opposition. Closing opposition tells us two things. The first thing they tell us is, at the point to which you have insurance companies, they are going to pressure companies to implement reforms, and therefore their main solvency on their side of the house is using insurance companies as the agents of change. 4 reasons why this is particularly problematic. Firstly, we thought it was a very uncharitable characterization because if the insurance companies are really so strict, companies would never seek out insurance anyway. So to an extent, I think there is some middle ground in which insurance companies will at least pay out some amount. But second, we argue that if you adopt the opening opposition characterization, the insurance companies are often so profitable, they are often far more likely to take this one-off hit. Why? Because expending massive bureaucratic efforts, like on their side of the house, hiring things like expensive auditors to investigate if companies have actually implemented efficacious reforms are actually a lot more expensive. Why? 2 reasons. Because a lot of times, these reforms are hard to measure and hard to quantify. How do you measure if a company has actually taken steps to solve things like workplace harassment? Because these are not explicit discrimination efforts. The problem we're facing in status quo is that a lot of discrimination in the workplace is very implicit. Things like microaggressions on the ground, things like sort of interactions in the way that like certain individuals use certain mansplaining terms, which means it's very hard to quantify and measure these types of reforms. But second, even if you can somehow measure and quantify the reforms, it is very hard to measure the efficacy because, for instance, if their mechanism is going onto the company and trying to interview female workers, I suggest it's very unlikely for female workers to want to speak up about structural abuse in the workplace because they fear alienating their bosses in positions of power. But third, let's assume the very best case on their side of the house, right? Where they do things like, look at the composition of the company, look at whether the company has implemented things like quotas. The problem is, it is still a stopgap measure to the extent that their best case scenario is one in which companies implement things like tokenistic reforms of quotas. What was the counterfactual Josh told you that was so much better? The counterfactual Josh told you was that instead of relying on individual auditors to try and scrutinize whether the company has actually done enough, we would rather use a court of law. We would rather use courts to be able to use a lot more resources and a lot more expertise to be able to engage in a lot more scrutiny. But most importantly, right, to the extent that all these things are very difficult to do and very expensive, the more plausible counterfactual that Josh tells you is that insurance companies would simply go and pressure witnesses to not speak up, would simply go and coerce victims to take settlement deals before you even go to court in the very first place. Therefore, on a consideration of plausibility, closing opposition is simply out of the debate if they really believe that insurance companies will be able to effectively implement workplace reforms in those companies. That is why their mechanism of solvency is simply implausible. Let's then talk about opening opposition's mechanism of solvency, because opening opposition says, hey, we have negative media backlash and therefore there are PR incentives to reform. 2 responses. Firstly, if huge insurance companies are extremely profitable, as what opening opposition characterizes, and they are a bottomless pit, this means insurance companies would always be able to afford the best lawyers to fight on very contentious points of law, which are oftentimes the delta in a lot of subtle discrimination lawsuits, like things like microaggressions and misogyny, which are often not expressly implemented tangibly within the workplace. Or they can do things like drag out court cases for a very, very long time, such that victims have no choice but to give up those court cases because the victims simply cannot afford the legal fees. What is the upshot of this argument? The upshot of this argument is that on a consideration of plausibility, it is very likely that these huge insurance companies will be able to get these cases dismissed. Why is that problematic? Because at the point to which these insurance companies will not get sued, and these companies will never get sued, this means that you will never get the media backlash, because you are now vindicated in a court of law. This means that on a consideration of optics, they lose, because the optics now is, we are not fucking guilty, right? Because we have been vindicated by a court of law. That is why on the idea of negative media backlash, opening opposition is out, because they reduce the negative media backlash that is on their side of the house. But the second thing Josh tells you that they also refuse to talk about is that at a point to which huge insurance companies can pressure individual victims to take on pre-trial settlements and Oftentimes this comes with like injunctions in which you cannot speak up. This means it never even goes to court to begin with. This means a sort of media scrutiny and media backlash cannot even happen because victims are prevented from speaking out because they've taken on these settlements. Why was the counterfactual a lot better? Because we told you at the counterfactual, individual small companies are far less likely to be able to afford these expensive lawyers. Individual small companies are unable to offer such a seductive and huge settlement fees, which means that on the comparative, it was far more likely that we got more cases in law. The last thing that opening opposition says is, there is a principle here. And what was the principle? They say, you know what? Companies do their best. Companies hire female talent. Companies are really trying their best. We cannot punish companies. Well, number one, above and beyond this being very implausible, if it's really not their fault, then these companies will never be convicted in a court of law anyways. This means on our side of the house, these companies would also have natural incentives to do things like workplace reform because they know that they will not get convicted in a court of law anyway. That is why we think we don't lose on the principle as well. But what does Josh further tell you in terms of incentives that I don't think is responded to by either OO or CO? What Josh tells you is that there is a problem in status quo. The problem in status quo is this. The insurance companies are the ones who fork out a huge sum of money. They are the ones who afford the expensive lawyer fees. They are the ones who afford things like settlements, not the companies. Even if there are things like insurance premiums, right? The problem Josh characterizes to you is that these insurance premiums are certain and very fixed costs that you pay every single month. Why was that important? The reason that was important is because the sort of shareholder incentives that opening opposition talks about doesn't exist. Because even if these premiums are high, at the point at which shareholders know about these high premiums, they've already internalized this as fixed costs. We parallel this to things like rent for factories, or parallel this to like salaries for workers, which are often fixed costs that individuals have internalized. The mechanism that Josh gives you on our counterfactual is that even if these companies are hugely profitable, the sort of uncertainty at the point at which you don't know how much of the settlement sum that you have to pay, at the point at which the uncertainty of not knowing how long the court cases would go, means that you have far greater pressure by shareholders to reform corporate culture, because now when you report the quarterly shareholder profits, you're actually having to report all these losses from always being able to have to afford expensive lawyers and long court cases. That was once again our counterfactual and why we beat both op teams. Why do we beat OG? Because OG hangs their case on the assumption that insurance premiums are always low, and therefore companies have no incentives to reform the culture. Josh told you that even if insurance premiums are high, taking on opening opposition's best case scenario, we told you why companies would still rather pay than to reform, because the people in positions of power are often your white privileged male who do not even view microaggressions as a problem. Therefore, on the consideration of plausibility and the consideration of solvency, we stand firmly in closing government.
We thank the government whip for that fine speech. Let's now call upon the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Just a second. If I can ask for POIs, you can wave a piece of paper at me from the camera, ideally. And can someone thumb me up if I'm audible and loud? Clear? Great. I'm going to talk about two things in the summary. The first, in terms of where we get more prevention, and secondly, how court cases look like on each side of the house, why theirs are significantly more nasty and awful. The first thing I want to talk about then is prevention. There's a couple of claims come from opening government in terms of why insurance companies are not good in doing prevention. They say, but like they won't be able to anticipate the risks because they are like insuring a lot of companies, so they can't just like go around and like audit all of them. Like, no, that just sounds inherently implausible, right? Like companies, like life insurance companies also don't like give the same price to everyone, even though like that potential price they're going to be paying is significantly lower. They still go and like create quite comprehensive risk profiles for each individual to make sure that they are able to profit as much as possible. This is how these companies get money. This is why like they are willing to invest into auditors that go and do those comprehensive risk profiles. It just makes no sense as an assertion. We think this is specifically the mechanism as to how we get prevention. I want to be very, very clear why this is a different mechanism than what opening opposition gave you. Opening opposition opening opposition tells you that the insurance companies will force you to change through inserting clauses in the existing contract. So they will say, so they can then avoid like paying for this thing. CG points out correctly that it's not like life insurance company would put in your contract that you have to stop smoking, because at the point at which you're already paying it enough, it doesn't really care insofar as like you're already like paying for the insofar as you're already paying for that potential fine anyway. The actual incentive for the companies to change happens even before they take up the insurance, when they are thinking about taking up the insurance, and then during the reviews, right? What this means is that before you are being set what kind of premium you get, you need to be willing to like get a very, very comprehensive risk assessment. Not that opening opposition always tells you like, oh, they're gonna like make some reforms. They never actually explain to you what are these things that they can change. They actually contradict themselves when they like talk about prevention, they talk about how these companies actually can't do anything. Very, very unclear what they wanted to say. Draft tells you that it's things like checking if your HR has a really obvious filing processes that are accessible to everyone, right? It's things like checking that there are constant trainings, making sure there are actual developments in terms of how your staff is performing on this. Closing government's response is like, but like if you come there, like ask your interview your female workers, like they won't talk, right? Like, there are a lot of actual quantifiable things that you can check properly, right? Like you can check if there were if there were claims that were filed before, if there were settlements being done, that people that were done in a proper manner. We think those are things that you can do quite obviously and quite well. We don't understand why not. Note also that you have a massive incentive to keep being as efficient as possible, insofar as you have the monthly or yearly like constant checkups where the auditors come and they check if nothing is like going to worse, and they have a massive incentive to do that, because like if they have any chance to like get extra money out of you, they will do it. Because of that, you have to be incredibly consistent in terms of what is going on. Like the responses that we get from closing government is like, but like if they were like so strict, they like wouldn't like go for those like anyway, right? Like note that they still would, right? Like still like the money that you have to pay is still lower than like plus like the PR damage is still significantly lower, so you still want to go for it. Secondly, we think that like currently companies have an independent wish to be seen as efficient in handling these cases, also because like you have quite a lot of like progressive public pressure from movements like Me Too. We think for that reason, right now when companies can get away with not paying the significant amounts of money, and they can even appear efficient, that's a win-win for that company, they will do it. Then they say like they won't be like wasting money on like the auditors, because like the companies are profitable anyway, so they can like get some losses. Like note that like the companies are profitable because they're getting money out of companies if they find them to be risky, which is why exactly they're going to be going and sending these auditors. That a response made absolutely zero sense. What this means is more efficiently than opening opposition, who I think got decently responded from closing government. We gave you an actual reason as to why companies are going to be changing their behaviors, why we get more efficient prevention on our side of the house. The second argument Rob then gives you is in terms of court cases. Note that like the reason why processes get worse that you get from opening opposition is that you get less claims, because like the companies are going to silence the victims. We think that's true, and that's obviously awful. We think our case, in cases where this goes to court, is significantly worse. I also want to point out, like on that level of pre-going to court, closing government is completely non-comparative when they say like these insurance companies are going to silence these people before this even goes to court. This is obviously non-comparative because you get silenced either by insurance company or by the company itself. We would posit that it's probably better if the insurance company at least gives you some compensation. The company literally has the ability to make your life living hell in the company or fire you. We think that's probably worse consequence than if the insurance company silences you. We feel both of this obviously really bad, but we think it's worse on that side of the house. Let's then talk about how court cases looks like, and recognize that the analysis on closing government actually explains exactly how companies are exposed during those public cases, exactly explains why our case works. Because if that scrutiny actually does increase, the company has an exceptional incentive to be extremely nasty in the court and win. If OG is right, and like paying the fine is something these companies really don't want to do, know that a really efficient mechanism how not to have to pay the fine is to win the court case and make like the actual other side have to pay pay for their expenses, right? Because of that, the company has a massive incentive to actually win that case and especially in cases where like the company can't even prevent the case to go to court. This is when they are going to do everything to an opening.
Even if you prove that insurance companies have some incentive and ability to influence internal processes, your burden is to show you why they have more incentive and ability than the companies themselves to prevent it.
No. Okay, so given that the company has such a massive fine to pay, they will do, instead of trying, because the company has such a massive fine to pay, and they can't prevent everything, the way they're gonna be acting is specifically with these things, right? They are more likely to be doing the silencing because on our side they can get away with it and they actually look PR well, right? Like, given that you're increasing the risk so much, the companies want to make sure that like they're never gonna get that like terrible optics that CG wants to talk about. What this means that in what these companies are likely to do is absolutely disgusting campaigns against the victim in the court. The optics of that is horrible because if the victim is destroyed by like company lawyers, like it obviously creates an awful public image. The insurance companies are comparatively significantly less likely to do that because they do not have that massive investment into public image of that particular company. So they're more likely to be accommodating in a sense that maybe they're going to be fight a bit, but they won't be going to the lengths that the company would be willing to go to. Because of that, we get better prevention and we get less nasty court cases in the end, closing opposition.
We thank the opposition whip for that fine speech. Thank you everybody once again for this really, really interesting PDQ. If you can just all leave the room.